Well, good morning, Clavette. How are you in Ottawa?
I'm fine, thank you very much.
I'm Doug Miller here in Montreal with Jane Armstrong in Toronto. We are undertaking interviews on behalf of SAC2 Solidarity Committee and the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Activist History Project. And we've invited you, Ken, to join us today because of your experience. I just wanted to ask you to verbally acknowledge that you have read and signed and agree with the conditions of the consent form, which talks about the various elements of how we'll use this information.
I, Ken Clavette, have read and agreed to this process and the recording and the distribution of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I'm, as I said, I don't know you very well, so it'd be very interesting if you could just give us a little bit of your personal background, how you came to become aware of apartheid and that kind of thing, and how you got involved there from in anti-apartheid and SAC2 Solidarity Committee.
Sure. My I guess a little bit of history is, as you know, I'm an Ottawa Valley boy. Pretty much grew up in Ottawa from the age of 7 on. I was growing up in the 70s in high school and starting from university. The anti-apartheid, that we would not call Rhodesia, we called it Zimbabwe, even though it was still run. and so I had that sort of general interest and understanding of the need for change. I got involved in the labor movement around 1979. I was working at National Defense at Uplands Air Base, and I was involved in my local. From I had a huge strike in 1980 with the clerks, biggest strike in Canada, single strike at the time.
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. What union is that part of?
Public Service Alliance of Canada. And I was in the Union of National Defense Employees component, local 611 at Uplands Air Base. So from there, I got involved in mostly the central labor bodies activities. I was probably a little too left for the Union of National Defense Employees. And so my activities there were all at the local level, and but then I got involved in the Labour Council as their delegate, and then in 82 I was elected to the executive, and 83 to 88 I was the president of the Labour Council, and that's probably where most of my activities with supporting SAC2 took place in that period of time, leading the council.
That's great. That's great. So in your understanding, like you say, you called it Zimbabwe. Where would you have picked all this up from? Was it in the air in Ottawa?
I think so. People like you probably, and others a little older than me, we're agitating and stuff. I remember I took an African history course with Dr. Savage, who had been with the executive director for the Association of Professors. And so I obviously had an interest in that was going on. So those are the kind of things probably that school, and it was a common, sort of coming right out of sort of civil rights movement stuff that was happening in Ireland and then Southern Africa, all just played together. It was all about human rights and human dignity and oppression and discrimination. So
yes, and even the anti-Vietnam War and the Southern U.S. Civil rights was very much talked about. Well, that's interesting. And so within the Labour Council, now the Labour Council, as I understand it, regroups all of the CLC-based the labor organizations in town, in the region, in a given area. So that's how you met SAC2, is it?
Yeah, I mean, and we used to talk about, say, Windsor was an auto town, or Sudbury was a steel town. PSAC was the Ottawa, but it never was active in join the Labour Council, and I think our local might have been 6. So we were not a big player in this, the CLC locally, or the District Labour Council. And so I actually I felt we had a Labour Council president from the letter carriers who was doing a lot of red baiting, and so I ended up running against him and replacing him. I became the first PSAC member in the country to actually head a Labour Council, and I was only 28 at the time. One fellow from the CBRT and GW, it's one of the railway unions, met me once and said, "You can't be a Labour Council president." And we were in a picket line. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" "Yeah." And he said, No, Labour Council presidents are old fat guys with beer bellies and funny looking ties.
And a cigar.
I guess that's the way of saying a lot of people are already suspicious of me. Plus, I wasn't a member of the NDP. And so if I was left and I wasn't a member of the NDP, who the hell was I? And that sort of dogged me right through. So yeah, so it was through that. And I don't remember, like, Jane, you guys were reaching out. I don't know what kind of contact. I don't remember having much contact with SAC2 Solidarity Committee, before we got involved. But there were people like Graham DeLine, who is the Office of Professional Employees and out of the QP staff, and Graham was very well versed in the anti-apartheid movement and on the executive with me. So there was those kind of influences. And then I remember just basically Zola Zemba coming a couple of times to Ottawa and coming to meetings. And when you came to Ottawa and you were SAC2, the CLC doors weren't open to you, right, Jane? So the Labour Council was the place you went to. You went to the postal workers, and you tried to build some other bridges in the community. And so that was, I think, the Labour Council was one of the ways into the Ottawa Labour movement for the activists around the Solidarity Committee.
I find that quite telling that the CLC was not receptive, but the local membership and their representatives were much more open.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go to a Labour Council, you tend to be more into solidarity. You're moving beyond your own national union, and so I think that kind of well, you tended to bring the more activist kind of people too, right? And the Ottawa Labour Council, probably because we were in Ottawa, had a bit of chip on our shoulders about, the CLC would like to sometimes control us because we were in town, and it had a long history. When Tommy Moore from the Carpenters was the Canadian Labour Congress president, Dominion Trades and Labour Congress president back in the 20s, he used to come to Labour Council meetings. I mean, national labor leaders at that day weren't jumping on airplanes that didn't exist and flying around the country. If he got out of town once a year on a train trip, he would probably be, that would be a big trip for him. So to stay plugged in, he would come to Labour Council meetings. So you'd have, that Dennis McDermott only ever came to a Labour Council once, and when we were saying goodbye to Len Rule, who was our CLC rep, and we had a bit of a party at the Labour Council. So there's always this tension between the local people and the Congress who wanted to speak. And in the case of South Africa, they saw the ANC and SAC2 as communists, and we were in the Cold War, and they didn't, they were an International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and that Cold War fought out its place there. So in the Ottawa Labour Council, we had people who thumbed our noses at our own national leadership, both the Congress and our affiliate nationals. So we like to be a little different, I think. Hey, Jane?
Yes, your memory? I remember your Pierre Samson. When was he president? Because we have a picture of Zola with him.
Okay, yeah, he would have been right after the CR strike. So I think he would have become president in '82, because he had been a local president in Montreal and went to the component convention after the CR strike, which had just throwing up all kinds of activists, and he became president of the employment and immigration component. Had 1 year doing that, and then at the convention ran as a sort of protest candidate against the establishment and won by 6 or 7 votes. And then only served one term because he was a nice man, but he was so over his head. Like he had no leadership development and stuff. But yeah, he was receptive to that. Like I remember he was much more open, and partly because he probably hadn't been trained in some way.
Could I ask what the CR is? I'm sorry.
We're the clerks. We were the biggest unit of the federal government, the bargaining unit. We were 60% female. There were somewhere around 60,000 of us,
Wow.
and we ended up with about 40,000 on strike in the fall of 1980, and so our local walked out early. We had a wildcat for an afternoon. It threw up a lot of activists, people who never went to meetings suddenly were walking picket lines, and it scared the shit out of the leadership of the union.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, and we found out later that we were looking for a COLA clause, and they had given it up in bargaining 6 months before we went on strike. They had taken it off the table, and there's no way they were going to get it back on. But we were in, high inflation rates at that point, where
oh my goodness,
interest rates were 20% and stuff. So there was a lot of anger, and so it changed the Public Service Alliance of Canada a lot. Gave voice to people like me and others that didn't have it before.
That would have been the period of that huge cross-Canada demonstration against wage freeze and inflation. And
I'm trying to think. There was one earlier. 76 was the big CLC one that was held the day of protest. But yeah, we held another one sometime in that period of time.
I think it was right after Trudeau got re-elected and broke all his promises right away. And
yes, he stole all Bob Stanfield's policies.
Yes.
Poor Bob. Bob was too honest.
Okay, sorry, carry on.
Go ahead. No, so I said those are sort of that was the environment. And so some of my funny stories I like to tell is that people were still trying to figure out who I was. So they had COSATU delegates come to the CLC, and they had a big reception one night. And I was working full time, like I was at the air base. I wasn't, I wasn't a elected full-time position or anything. Anyway, they invited me to come as the new Labour Council president, and so I knew there was some tension. So I took this little pin here.
I see it.
To my lapel. I filled it. I looked like that back then. That's what I looked like.
Lovely hair.
Probably, yeah, I had hair and everything. Well, I had more hair on top and less below. I had, I did shave my beard off when I was Labour Council president because I felt I had to look respectable at city council and stuff. But yeah, I had that jacket on and I put the pin on. So I went into the CLC and it was very shortly after being in that room that I met every CLC staffer in that room who came over to find out who this guy was. And the South Africans said hi to me and then ran away. And then someone came over to me later and said, "We can't talk to you in this room. We're going to have a meeting in the parking lot after. Okay, come and talk to us then." And so,
oh wow,
so that's one of my SAC2 stories. So I went out to the parking lot, and they said, "Who the hell are you? And this is a really weird country. What are all the people? And they're all anti-SAC2, and we can't say anything about SAC2. And we're SAC2 in the country, and they're us outside the country, and I think I spent more time trying to explain to them why, because they wouldn't have had the benefit of the Janes and so of SAC2 to sort of explain who they were meeting and what the tensions were. So yeah, so they talked about me, I think, for a long time, the idiot that walked into a CLC meeting with a SAC2 pin on his lapel.
Would you just? Would you just mind holding it up to the camera a little bit closer for a minute?
Yeah, let's see if we get it. I know there's several of them flying around here, being given out. I know this is part of the collection. This is my only last one. Hangs off my lamp off my desk. But and this one here was the anniversary, the 1955 85 pin, and I was Labour Council president during that time. So someone had given it to Jane or Ken, or I don't know, Brenda, someone had given it to me at some point in time. So I mean, I was partly just being young and cocky, but also I was the kind of person that just made sure that people knew where I stood. I wasn't going to be hiding it. I opposed apartheid. I thought it was criminal, and I was going to tell people about it and defend that position. And I would let the South Africa. My argument would be, I'd let South Africans decide who's going to represent South Africans, not us. You know, I wouldn't have probably used the term colonialism, which we throw around so easily now, but it would have been that attitude. It's like they're going to represent themselves, and right now they're having difficulty even, you know, trying to achieve democracy. But we're going to respect what they have. So it tagged me early on with the establishment of the CLC. But then it carried on. It carried on with Palestine, you know, and I remember we would always be other unions around town, or the auto workers, or someone who would bring a speaker in, and they speak at the Labour Council. And then I remember one nasty letter I got from Shirley Carr saying, you know, who said you could have this meeting with the these Palestinians, you know, and the rest of the executive wanted to get into a big fight. And I said, you know, the only letter I want to send back is and say, well, Bob White said we could, but I said, that's just going to make her have a hemorrhage, and ignore her, and she goes away. Don't get into a pissing match with her, you know. And so we just ignored her letter and carried on doing things like that. So that sort of tells you a bit of who I am and how I approach things. Wow. I think the other story I tell, and it was a freaky one, and I wish I had kept notes and, you know, wrote things down. But I was in the building I worked in was Hangar 3 at Uplands Air Base, and it was part of the Commonwealth training plan that was put up at the beginning of the Second World War. So these are cooker cuddy kind of hangars that were, you know, thrown up across the country, and Ottawa had a training base as well. So they were quite old, and I always felt there was kind of history in the place. James Cagney had made a movie there called Captains of the Sky, and, you know, and for someone who likes history, I just walk around these buildings thinking, you know, like, you know, there were young men here who had walked and drank and partied and then went off and died.
They called them temporary buildings for about 50 years.
Yeah, well, they finally only tore them down after they closed the base with one of the Chrétien cuts. But yeah, they had survived a long time, and when I was there, they weren't being used any longer as aircraft hangars. I was in a warehouse for supplies. I was in the supply section, and so we had lots of staplers and pencils and papers and ribbons for typewriters that we shipped to National Defence Headquarters and around the region. One of them was a hockey rink. The other one was a repair and disposal. The auto mechanics was done in another. So these were older, smaller hangars. But because they were weird, there was lots of different strange things happening. So one day I went to pick up my phone, and my phone was a big old black thing with a dial on it. Now, this would have been around 85, I would think, give or take. And my phone was dead, no dial tone, no nothing. So I went next door to the secretary's office, and she was the secretary for the major in charge of the section, the chief warrant officer, the captain, and the phone would have those little lights on the bottom.
Oh, the buttons to connect the lines.
To push it. So I pushed one of the buttons and picked up the phone, and I said, "Oh, excuse me," because there were voices on there. And then I looked down, and there was no light on the phone. So like, I wouldn't have picked up a line, and I couldn't have actually cut in if someone was on there. So I'm listening to it, and it's Ken Trainer and Jeff Bickerton from the Postal Workers, the research director, having this conversation. So I know one of them is down in Metcalfe Street and the other one's in Toronto. Yeah, and I'm getting goosebumps. So I hang up the phone and it's no lights, and I pick up the phone again, the same line, and they're still there talking away. And I'm saying, hello, guys. Hi. Hello. 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 And they couldn't hear me.
Wow.
So yeah, I was a little freaked out, and went home and called my CLC rep, Donnie McDonald, and explained what had happened. And he said, I just always worked on my life that we're always being spied on. So, just take it that way, Ken. And then I called Jeff that night at home and said, oh, you and Ken were having a conversation today. And I told him a little bit about the conversation. He said, yes, were you talking to him today? And I said, no, I was listening to you guys.
Wow.
on my boss's phone. So that was a really weird thing, is obviously I was under some kind of surveillance, but they thought maybe I would use another phone rather than my own. So whenever this system went down, I realized now they were monitoring the major's phone, they were monitoring the captain's phone and the chief warrant officer's phone, because I was working for them. so it was probably military intelligence and that was doing it, because they had one of the biggest surveillance of the labor movement, we found out during the FLQ crisis. And yeah, I felt bad for these poor guys, because their personal life, if they were doing anything, someone was listening in to them that they didn't expect. But then my father-in-law worked for Bell, and I told him that story, or had worked for Bell. He went on to work for a CFRA radio station as a chief engineer in '62. So he said, there's a room downtown that has limited access to people. And he said, but we all know all the lines in the region that are being monitored go through that room. So something happened in that room that crossed your line with Jeff Bickerton's line, and so oddly you picked up on their phone call. But yeah, so that was a pretty freaky Kisatu moment, or Saku moment.
Absolutely.
And then you laugh, because there's a lot of time and energy put into monitoring people like me who just want democracy. We were not overthrowing anything. We were trying to win a strike or get better better benefits for somebody and a group of workers. So they were wasting a lot of precious energy and time. But that's my second SAC2 story, that they obviously, the federal government and the agencies that spy on people felt that the Janes and so of this world were dangerous, and the people they were talking to were dangerous. And so that's when you get Mulrooney, suddenly being a hero of the anti-apartheid movement, and you're thinking, yeah, but you guys were spying. The same government was spying on us, and terrified that we were going to overthrow the world and create democracy.
And this is very clearly the Cold War at work.
Yeah, this was definitely in the in the mid '80s. As I said earlier, I wasn't a member of the NDP, so if I wasn't a member of the NDP, I had to be some sort of weird communist of some kind. And so while I had really good relationships locally with people like Marion Dewar, who was the mayor for part of the time I was Labour Council president. Marion and she was born in Buckingham too. So as soon as she found out I was born in Buckingham, that was like this. And Marion was a big table person. She would have no trouble having a conservative member of parliament sitting at a table with a trade union activist, and so her and I worked really well together. And Mike Cassidy, who had been the leader of the NDP provincially, was in town, and him and I got along really well, and we ended up participating with 3 other PSAC members on a charter rice case, and we ended up winning at the Supreme Court to get political rights for public servants. So I mean, the kind of stuff I'm doing with SAC too, with also the kind of stuff I was doing locally. It's like public servants should have political rights. They're not going to wear their political buttons at work, but they should be able to have a lawn sign or go door to door, and we couldn't. It was a firing offense in those days. So those are the kind of things. But yeah, for provincially, the Federation of Labor, they saw me as a very dangerous person. But their analysis was actually as stupid as the government. I remember them talking to me about one of the fellows, Peter Larson, who was WCP, Workers' Communist Party, Maoist. I had a PhD in housing from a university in France, but had that whole philosophy of that movement was to go and be with the workers. So he went to Ladouis and he was a typesetter and with the typographical workers. Of course, all the co-workers just thought he was crazy because they wanted their kids to go to university and get a PhD and not have to do that kind
Le
of work.
Droit is the local French newspaper in French language newspaper in Ottawa.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Started by the Oblates. Anyway, Peter actually didn't support me. He thought he wanted to support the letter carrier guy because he felt he was more working class. So the OFL pulls me aside and is telling me about all the dangers of my Labour Council, and I've got all these lefties, and they describe Peter, and it's like looking at them and go, you realize he's the most right-wing member of my executive, right? He hates the Soviet Union. He thinks the Soviet Union should be nuked. I mean, he's a Maoist. And they weren't getting along. Like, I don't think you have to worry about him and the Soviet Union. It's like over top of their heads, just didn't get it. So
I know it. I mean, it's so laughable when you look at it now, but it was so real, and especially with the presence of the military in Ottawa. They were amongst the most right wing of the gang. I know ex-military that joined CUSO and would contest me on that communist bugaboo about apartheid.
Yeah, they. Well, I mean, it was indoctrinated, right? It was just so much part of who we were at the time, but also just very ignorant. Like, I was analyzing who these other people were around me. What is a WCP and who is, but I also remember years afterwards, we had. When I was with UNDI, Defense Employees, we had the Communication Security Establishment, who were, the NSA of Canada, and they were mostly young people recruited right out of university, and ex-military and signals people who would come in, and they were spying on the embassies and so on. But Peter Cormier, who was eventually a vice president of the UNDI, had told me that he was coming to Labour Council meetings, and they were having drinks. We'd have drinks after all the time, and he was listening to this guy talk, and he looked at him and said, "You're Russian, aren't you?" And the guy said, "Yeah." "How do you know that?" He said, "You don't use articles." I found out that Peter had been trained to speak Russian, and this guy, and I don't remember the guy, and Peter remembered him, but he used to be an attaché with the Soviet embassy who would come to the Labour Council meetings, or had come to a number of the Labour Council meetings, and they would go out and have a drink with us after. He was probably a cultural attaché of some kind, but he was doing his job to suss out what was going on in the common culture of and filing reports back. So there was, we were in the middle of the Cold War at that time still.
Wow.
It was
the Ontario Federation of Labor, somebody coming to tell you about, who you're associating with. Was that the time of Cliff Pilkey and Louis Lankinski, who were in the leadership?
Louis was just Louis was still there. I have a Polish solidarity pin that Louis gave me. We flew together out to the Winnipeg CLC convention, I think it was, or Vancouver. Vancouver CLC convention. Yeah, so Pilkey was there. The staff people were Alan Pride and Len Rule. And when I said we had a party for our CLC rep, it was Len Rule we had the party for, and that was the only time Dennis and I had ever met personally. And you know, we had 40 people at the Labour Council hall, and Len had come in, and again the same thing. You know, he was, and I just said, Len, just hang around, you know, and judge us when you. And I said the same to Donald McDonald, the person who replaced me. And you know, after about a year, Donald said, you know, all the stuff I heard about you guys, and you guys are just doing the stuff Labour Council should do. You're a great group of people, and I'm really happy to be here with you. But we knew this sort of thing from the CLC, you know, and so when we gave our gift to Len Rule, my speech was, you know, the poor guy, he came from Windsor and a very narrow-minded view, and then he's thrown into Ottawa and he's trying to figure it all out. And he knows we're lefties, and he doesn't know what color our flag is or what we are. So I think it's about time we tell him. And so I gave him a copy of Mao's little red book of quotations. and I had told the executive I was going to do this, and they were just totally freaked out. They said, it's going to confirm all their suspicions. And I said, no, it's going to make fun of them. It's going to make fun of all their suspicions. And Len would talk to me about that years after, if I saw him at a convention or something. But yeah, those boys were, you know, you were either NDP or you were a communist, and they gave me a lot, well, particularly Porter gave me a lot of Alan Pride, sorry, gave me a lot of time. But I also served 1 year on the executive at Cliff, and so I often, particularly when Cliff passed away, and everyone was going on, and I had some quiet conversations because I couldn't have them open. I said, you know, like, Cliff was really good on women's issues, because there's no way he could take Judy Darcy on, who was a WCP background, on both issues. And so he had to give, he wasn't going to take the women's movement on while he was trying to fight the left. You know, and so yeah, he was very easy for him to embrace choice and a bunch of other things, because his real fight was with the left. It was with people like me who were going to rock the boat, the young Turks coming in, you know. So I never saw him as progressive as a lot of the sisters in the movement did, because I think he was a very strategic, calculated person, and he certainly was not a supporter of the mild left, really. I mean, I remember poor postal workers, Bill Shador. Remember Bill?
Oh yes.
Bill had this huge stock of white hair and a black beard. And we'd be at the convention, and there'd be like 4 mics, and Bill would be at a con, and Cliff would just be bouncing around, and he'd have the other 2 mics each get a double chance, and he couldn't recognize Bill at the mics.
Do you remember, I think it might have been 1983 Ontario Federation of Labour Convention, and you probably would have been there as president of the Labour Council, when there was a resolution came to the floor of the Ontario Federation of Labour Convention in support of sector. It was a composite resolution because there were so many that had been submitted. And the committee, under Robert's Rules of Order, had a recommendation of non-concurrence. By that point in time, Bob White had gotten fed up with, you know, this battle. And of course, he'd been supportive since 1980, since the get-go. Do you remember him coming down from the dais at the front to a mic on the floor and giving a barn burner of a speech about why we had to take a stronger stand, anti-apartheid? And the convention just roared and voted down the recommendation of non-concurrence. And that was the end of that. Thereafter,
after that,
posters, the OFL jointly did a poster with the SAC Solidarity Committee, and it's on the website, the new website that Ken Trainer has put together. We put that poster up there. But do you remember that convention?
Yeah, vaguely. I think that was my first convention too, so I was probably like,
Sounds
trying
like
to figure out.
sounds like crazy politics, man. Really fun.
It was a strange time, Doug. You know, I mean, I knew I was left and I wasn't aligned with anything, but I just knew what was right and wrong is what I saw it as. But I also knew labor history. So and I just one of my passions and just kept it right through. So but what happened was, you know, things like May Day, the PSAC Regional Council and the NDP Regional Council would have May Day events, usually a picnic or something, which is dangerous in Ottawa on May 1st because you could also have a snowstorm. But they weren't allowed to put those posters up at the CLC. They were barred.
Oh boy!
It was a communist. It was a communist day. And so by the time I came around, the Labour Council was involved. Now, mostly we just had a dance, you know, we mostly just had a couple of speakers and we, you know, again, you didn't have big parades in Ottawa until June.
Well, we in Montreal, we did.
You did in Montreal, yeah. Okay, you're a hardier group. So that was the environment we were in. You know, even the NDP, the posters, if they were supporting May Day, couldn't go up at the Congress. Sister Carr never wrote "In Solidarity" on her letters. She always wrote "Fraternally Yours," because In Solidarity was a communist thing. And we just all laughed at her because we knew she was saying "In Brotherly Yours," and she was a woman. The first woman to head up the Congress, you know, and it was like, you just shook your head, and you know, those who wanted to fight would fight. I just walked away and ignored them and tried to go on and do things. But yeah, and I was involved in the action caucus at both the CLC and the OFL because I was hanging around with the postal workers and people like that who sort of brought me around and introduced me to different people. And it also, when people would find out what I was doing, they'd say, "That sounds like a really good committee. You mean you find out what's going to happen the next day and you organize? Oh, that's really needed. We need that. We need more of that."
Good stuff.
And these were just PSAC delegates who were trying to figure out what the hell was going on, right? So that was the time. It wasn't a fun time at a lot of the time, but it also was a fun time because you certainly know who was who. I find more recently people will claim to be progressive and they're really just right wingers. And I often, you know, when the last two presidents of the CLC before B, I would say, give me Shirley Carr back. She did things and we did things and she couldn't stop us. Now we've got leadership that really are just bland, you know, and they don't do anything except talk to politicians and you know, campaign to get on the Senate. Both of them campaigned really hard to get on the Senate, and one was successful. Wow. And you know, that's not where the movement was when I was involved. I often said this to some of the younger people coming up behind me. I said, you know, I think we should talk to politicians, no problem. But I think you have to let them know there's 10,000 people that are going to be outside their door if you don't listen to them. And if you can't promise that, or even 500, they're not going to listen to you. You know, you got to be able to mobilize. And that's the work. That's the hard work, is to get those people there so that the people inside the buildings listen to you because they know you will organize the next election or.
With that idea, that concept, were you part of the big days of action? What year was that, Jane?
The Ontario Federation of Labour Days of Action, when we shut down various cities, was
no. I'm talking about the anti-apartheid when
the anti-apartheid in 1986. We basically put out a call across the country to all the unions that we had contacts with to have a week of action in March of '86. And do you recall that at all?
No, this is where our memories start to fade. We should have done this interview 20 years ago.
Yes.
I don't specifically remember any action that I spoke at or anything. Again, the thing that was weird with me is I was a full-time worker, right? And I was at the south end of the city at Uplands. A lot of people thought I worked at National Defense Headquarters because that's all they thought of. I couldn't go to stuff on the hill. It took me like a half hour to get from the base, and I didn't have a car, so someone would drive me to get to some function and then get back, even with an hour-long lunch. So I missed a lot of stuff just because of where I was. If it took place downtown, I'd usually get another officer of the Labour Council to speak on behalf of the Labour Council at things. So I don't remember what we did in Ottawa for that.
Well, there were a number of actions that happened across the country. Postal workers refused to handle any mail to or from South Africa. Airline workers refused to take reservations. Others did demonstrations in front of stores trying to stop South African products, particularly fruit. Tin fruit was a big import. So there were a range of actions across the country. And quite frankly, Ken, the six of us all had to read the friggin' newsletters again to twig our own memories of when things happened. It was just like this fog of 30 plus years ago. And that helped a lot, as well as these oral histories have reminded all of us of, oh yes, I'd forgotten about that. And I remember your story that you related at the Toronto Workers' History Project evening.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh yes, I'd forgotten about that event of the hearing the phone.
Yeah, Ken tried to steal it on me just because he was on the other end of the phone.
Actually,
my story, Ken.
Actually,
But,
Ken did an Access to Information Act to the RCMP, I believe it was, and they came back with no record at all. So,
well, I think it would be D&D. I mean, I think that's where that phone call was being monitored. I don't think it was being audited by the RCMP. CSIS was just getting created around that period of time.
Yeah.
And they're not supposed to be doing internal. CSIS is internal, and communication security establishment is external. But yeah, it was D&D intelligence that were tapping my phone. They wouldn't have to do anything. It's a D&D phone, right? And so if Ken wants to go do an access, it's probably somewhere there. And the thing that was interesting about the progressive movement, so you said you've kept newsletters, and it's like, oh wow, great, because most working class history is thrown out very quickly. And it's very unusual that you can actually go there. When I first got involved in Ottawa, there was a group called the Ottawa Committee for Labour Action. And these were mostly people who were independent lefties who had actually been Waffle members and were expelled.
Oh, yes, I remember them, yes.
So Jeff Bickerton was part of that group and a bunch of others, and they had a labor focus magazine. So a couple of years ago, I started, just before COVID, I started trying to reach out to people and say, like, what's happened? Did you keep minutes? Well, no, they didn't keep minutes because they were a lefty organization, and they were afraid some people would lose their jobs because they were in unions that were more conservative and so on. But I said, well, the people like me were really influenced in my development by reading those newsletters, and one of the profs from Carleton who was involved said, I have a whole bunch in the basement, and he ran to the basement and then came back and said, yeah, I got a whole bunch of 2 issues. He had a 12-inch pack of the newsletters, and he thought they were, no one kept them. They read them and they threw them out. And so it's really hard to actually to go back and do things. And as I said, you could go to the archives, because I know that the Labour Council records are in the archives, because at one point in time, the National Archives was collecting history from any labor organization in Ottawa. Most of the national unions were headquartered here, and someone tapped the Labour Council on the shoulder. And so our records go back to 1900. And then a few years ago, they were trying to move it off somewhere else because, of course, they realized, well, we got too much stuff, and this is an Ottawa council. Why is it doing it in the National Archives? But they saved most of the union charters from that early period, and I know I helped save the first union in town was 102 of the typographical workers, and that was from the 1870s, and their charter was on the wall, the office cohabitating with the Labour Council, and I convinced the business agent there to get it given to the archive, but demanding they give him a full reproduction photograph and life size, and put it on his wall. And a year later, there was a fire in the building, or 2 years later, and all the water came down that wall, and he called me up and said, "I'm so glad you convinced us to do that. I can now get it replaced easily." So Jane, I can commend you guys who moved around the country and managed to keep your newsletters and stuff, because there may be a file at the Labour Council, but I don't know.
We didn't. It's Doug and Vince Greason who
Really?
did them in French and English. Wow. Anyway, they rounded them up, and Ken Trainer has digitized them, and those big orange and black, full scap size, legal size. And so they're on the website that Ken has put together, and I'll resend you the link to the website, because we also those two and Ken Lucard as well kept bits and pieces of correspondence, because when Peter Mashlangu came, he was the SACTU rep for about 1.5 years, and then he moved to be the ANC rep when Joe Salucci left. And we packed up. Aaron Pemba, aka Bibi, came and said, look, SACTU is changing its international relations and how it's doing things. And of course, things were happening rapidly in 87, 88 in South Africa. So we packed up all our boxes with Peter, and because we kept really good records, and it all went to the ANC office, and we have no idea what happened after that.
Can I just return us a little bit more to a current framework, the fact that we have Ken with us, and ask Jane if you have any other items that we could ask Ken to focus on about SACTU solidarity.
Just was thinking also about the 1986 CLC convention. Where Jay Naidu spoke. Do you recall that at all? He was the leader of the newly formed PSAC.
Yeah, I do remember that. I think that was that a Vancouver or convention or the Toronto convention?
Good question. Can't remember.
We'd have to again. Yes, I do remember that kind of breakthrough. And I think the most, you're talking about the office and the work that was done. I mean, the most important thing about the anti-apartheid movement, like any movement, is the grassroots and building, And so what was really important is if you came in and talked to a bunch of trade union people about, we don't have rights and we don't have the vote, they would be sympathetic. But the solidarity of the workers, of workers talking to workers, I think those are the really strong things that laid the foundation, so that eventually people like Mulrooney and stuff had, he wasn't inventing this stuff. It was built on the fact that for the better part of a decade, we had been active at the grassroots, whether it was students organizations or the trade union movement, and most of us didn't give a shit about whether or not SACTU or Solidarity were part of the ICFTU. That was something for people over on Riverside Drive, and you go to meetings, and that's great. But we're talking about the fact that and they taught me some lessons. I remember talking to one of them and saying, it must be just wonderful, like the energy when you come to union meetings and stuff. And he goes, we only get people at union meetings when we have a collective agreement to ratify. Yeah. It's the same as you, People don't come to meetings unless they're really upset at something we did.
Yes.
But yeah, it was it was an interesting time. I remember Paul Purett. This was now in the 90s, I guess, because
I think so, yes.
we had the CLC actually meeting with South African trade unionists, and I went out took one of them out to dinner, and we had a great conversation. We were so good. We got up and walked out of the place, and when I walked him back to Paul's a few blocks away, he said, "Well, thanks for buying my meal." And I went, "Oh crap, we didn't pay for our meal." But I remember giving him a couple of audio tapes, a little, cassette tapes that I had made from CBC Ideas. And one of them was on the history of May Day, and the other one I think was on the Cold War and Canadian labor movement. And I said, these are things that will explain Canadians to you and what we've been dealing with, and how. And so they went off to the miners' union, I think it was in South Africa. And I wanted to go else listen to them, but yeah, it was at laying the groundwork that was really important. That on worker to worker relationships then made people not pick up a can of South African peaches, or would talk to their politicians about why it was important to have democracy. And it was really hard, like in Canada, to, you'd have to use the Cold War. Oh, they're just all communists. They just want to vote. It's an election coming up. I'm getting to vote, But that work that the people at the Sac du Solidarity Committee did was really, I think, really important. So I'm glad we're saving some of that history and putting it out there.
Well, and the Library and Archives Canada have been most welcoming. Brenda and I put together the application and thought, well, we'll see. Not only were they interested, they really encouraged us to do these oral histories.
Right.
And so that's that, and searching for putting together a bibliography of any reference whatsoever to support for SACTU and anti-apartheid work within the labor movement. We've kept our focus narrow to the labor movement. So they've been very encouraging. So we just
Who are you dealing with them?
Dalton Campbell.
Okay, no. I mean, most of the people I know are retired.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think
they were older. They were older than me. I know one of my students was oh Jesus, when would that been? I'm not even going to say it. She was a Algonquin College placement student with me, and she's now the head of the motion picture and audio archives at the archives.
Oh, that's tremendous. That's tremendous.
Yeah, it was really cool to see her.
Well, I think we've covered the SACTU for recording purposes. We can have a social chat for sure, but I'm going to turn the recorder off now. So to do so, I am going to also formally thank you so much, Ken Clavette. What a wonderful storyteller you are, and great stories to boot. And a wonderful analysis. Wonderful analysis.
History is telling stories, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm just going to turn the recorder off, and then we can